I think somewhere I'll switch screens. Good. Let me just switch over.
Hopefully it should be coming to you.
Okay. And you should see my screen too, right?
Yep, you're all
Great.
set.
Great. All right. So thank you. I appreciate that introduction and everything. My name is Bryan Cafferky. This is Advanced PowerShell Development. And a little background quickly, I lead and founded the Rhode Island Microsoft Business Intelligence User Group, which meets just over the border in Massachusetts border to Rhode Island. So if you're in anywhere in the Boston area into Rhode Island or whatever, you could get to the group really easily. My Twitter account is Bryan Cafferky, and I have my email is bryan256@msn.com, and you can get my blog on www.sql-fi.com. And I'm a business intelligence consultant that have been doing this for decades and working with SQL Server and all the good things for quite a while. So bit more of a development person than I am a PowerShell. So I'm not strictly a PowerShell developer, really more SQL Server developer. And got so excited a couple of years ago on PowerShell, kind of like the most exciting thing I'd seen in a long time, that I wanted to write a book on it. And I wanted to write all the things that I could never find in blogs. I found a lot of great blogs that would give me the kernel of an idea, a little bit of a script, but not a full-blown function that did exactly what I need. So I wrote a book called Pro PowerShell for Database Developers by Apresh. Mike Robbins was actually the tech reviewer for this, which was a great help for me. Did a great job. And he kind of made me follow more of the proper conventions for PowerShell because I was a bit of a rogue in the beginning. So there's a lot of good stuff in there, some of which will come out in this presentation. Oh, and I do like to use memes a little bit because this is normally a in-person presentation, but I find memes are a little bit way of breaking up topics so you don't get falling asleep. And this one has the original series Star Trek memes to kind of, hopefully if you're familiar with it, then you'll find some humorous. And the thing with the red shirts is they're always the ones that seem to die in an early episode or early show. So the goals of the presentation is one, to familiarize you with PowerShell features designed to support what I'll also call professional application development. What I mean by that is stuff that makes it deployable, maintainable, the nicer features and elegance to make it a full-blown production supportable language. Because I treat PowerShell really as more of a development language, not just some little scripts and things, and done some things like that. And there's some really nice features that you can use or you can not use. PowerShell doesn't force you to. So I'll talk about some of those things. And I want to demonstrate techniques to implement those features. So these are more ideas. It's kind of a little recipe-ish in some ways to see what you would want to use, but to give you some ideas what can be done. So the areas that I want to focus on is, one is big fan of reusability. I hate writing the same thing twice. So the first point is maximizing reusability with advanced functions. We'll talk about what that means. Increasing the extensibility using script modules. Adding support for user interaction, Windows GUI kind of thing. Efficiently accessing SQL Server, so not the SQL PS module. Adding support for application configuration, which is, to me, really critical. Once you get beyond the basic testing and things, you want something you don't have to go and make code changes to if server names change and things. So that's that point. And finally, adding support for pipeline processing. And that's a bit thrown out there, but I find a lot of people, from what I've seen, kind of avoid writing functions that actually deal with the pipeline. And I think it's kind of too bad because it's a very powerful thing to use and surprisingly easy to implement. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. Okay, more references to the red shirts going to their death. So, all right, so the first thing is advanced functions. Ironically, all it means to say call a PowerShell function advanced is you put this, what they call an attribute, called the cmdletbinding attribute, into the function. It changes the format header a little for a function a little different, but basically you put cmdletbinding, and then you put the parameters. You can put the parameters and then parentheses what all your parameters are to the function. Now, without cmdletbinding, typically you would just put the open parentheses after the name of the function, and then just put your parameter variables in place, and you'd be done. So it's a little different. You actually do an open braces, and then cmdletbinding, and then all the related attributes for cmdletbinding that go with it. So the thing that's really all there is to activating cmdletbinding. But what it does is it hooks you into PowerShell, to the actual PowerShell environment in a way that you don't normally get. And it's a very unusual feature. I've never seen another language do this. But for instance, PowerShell has the support, for instance, for the write verbose statement, which you can see a few lines into the function. Without the cmdletbinding attribute, the right verbose will be ignored because that's a PowerShell inherited supported feature, which is really part of the PowerShell environment, if you will, a common parameter. So by putting cmdlet binding in place, you get access to all the common parameters and built-in functionality of PowerShell. So without that, if I were to try to use right verbose, it would fail. It just wouldn't work. It would ignore the statement if I put that in without the cmdlet binding. And I'll kind of show some of that a little bit. But that's the main thing with cmdlet binding is it activates that. It also lets you do a lot of things on your parameters. For instance, not only can I define, you see at the top where it says parameter, not only can I define the parameters and the types, but I can do things like validate what's coming in. I can do all kinds of additional things, do edits on the variables coming in, all kinds of things like that. So it's a very powerful feature, and I'm going to show that in a sec, but the other thing here is the invoke SQL statement is just showing that I'm passing either by parameter name, function parameter name, or I can just do it by position. So generally in PowerShell conventions, people favor passing with name, so showing that here. Okay, so to kind of go back to what we just did, let me just go over here. And now on PowerShell, you can see what we just saw. So we can see the open verbose stuff going on. And I'm just going to run this to define the function. Let's hope that goes through. And that just returns some values. And didn't do anything fancy there. But now let's say I said, so now I'm just highlighting it. I like to comment out. Usually what I'll do in a function, which is a good idea, is I'll put an example of a call to the function, but I'll comment it out so it doesn't affect the code. But if somebody goes into my script module or my function code, they'll see an example of how to call it. So it just makes it a little bit easier. And in the ISC, which is I'm in now, by clicking on the icon with the page and the little arrow, or just press F8, it'll run just that single statement. So if I go up to the top here, now I see open connection. Okay, and you can see that's coming out from here. So just a slight side benefit, -debug is also supported, but as a result of putting in just this cmdlet binding, I now get access to the right verbose, right debug, things like that. There's a whole bunch of features. Basically, anytime you see documented in the PowerShell documentation, this is a common parameter, that is automatically going to be supported once you put the cmdlet binding into your function. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff. Some of it we'll see kind of implicitly as I go through some code examples, like validating code, things like that. So it's kind of a nice, handy thing. Okay, and let me go back. Oops, sorry. I have to remember to go back where I started from. Okay, so another thing I just wanted to show, another example of using advanced functions, is this kind of sample one. You may not, this is meant to be out my speaker, so we'll see how good it comes across. Something's going wrong with my speaker. What do you want me to say? Okay, so that's, I won't. Okay, so it does speak a little bit, but I don't want to beat it to death. So a couple of things with advanced functions, and this is really not the cmdlet binding, but I'll make a plug for these tags you also can put into functions. These tags are extremely useful because they document the code, and it's a little like Java doc, in that when you put a period and the text following it becomes documentation, which is supported by getting for the help function and things. So it'll display that when you ask for help on a function. So it's really kind of handy that way. And the cmdlet binding here is allowing me to do something. Notice here I have a validate. So I have also a default, so I can assign a default value, which is what it said when it finally spoke. But so this string will be what it defaults if I don't give it one. But I'm also telling it it has to validate the length from 1 to 50. And let's see if I can get to speak again. Good evening, everyone. Okay, so you got that. Now it actually seems to be speaking. I'm not sure how well you can hear it. I'm using my headset. But it's also, I use the -debug, and that's here. So because I have the cmdlet binding, you can see the verbose message came up, as well as the debug telling me something happened. And you can see the right verbose and right debug. And for what people any interest, Write Debug is actually something when you hit it, it'll come up by default and give you options as to whether you want to continue or stop and things like that. So it really is more intended for debugging. And Write Verbose is just meant to give you extra verbose messages when you want it. And I tend to use those for testing purposes to give me a lot of junk that I don't want the users to see in the end, but I like for debugging purposes and tracing. So I'll use Write Verbose, but then at the end, I'll just take the parameter off when I make my call. So that's one of the nice things about that. So cmdletbinding gives you a lot of that. There's a bunch of different validation type of functions you can use. You can even, and I do this in my book, I use a validate and I call another function and pass that parameter into it and validate it that way. And it basically comes back with true false. And if it comes back with false, it kicks it out of validation. So you get a lot of extra functionality for doing that. All right, so what was the other? Okay, just one other example I'm going to give you here. So another example, again, kind of just highlighting a bit here, cmdletbinding, but also functions and things, using join path. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to use something that Windows has built in called common dialogues. So I want to create a little bit of a GUI for my script, and what sometimes you have to do is you want to do something like open a file that's on the system or save a file, or maybe pick from a color palette. Those are actually built into Windows. They're predefined, and you don't have to rewrite them every time you want to use them. So what I'm doing here is I'm just wrapping those up in a function, and by using this, I'm actually going into Windows and pointing to the built-in common dialog. And I want to be able to set this. This is to be able to open a file, so get a file name, and I can default the initial directory to whatever I want to pass in as a parameter. But if you don't give it a default, then the default becomes this. And what I do is, I don't know if you've ever maybe used these, but env, $env : is a virtual drive, if you will. It's a provider that gives you a view into the environment variables. So just to see what's in there, it says that's my C drive, and the home path will be my home folder. So a nice way to make my code sort of independent, reusable, and adaptable to whoever's running it is to use the env variables, and kind of in this way I'm stringing them together to create a path, which would work for anybody because they should have, they're pointing to this drive and this path that should exist. And so if I run this, and then again, I like to just kind of highlight it separate. So I'm running the function I just defined, and it just brings up a list, and I can just kind of go wherever I want to go with. And eventually I'll find something I can pick. And then the message is coming back, Write Verbose, which is only supported because of cmdletbinding, tells me what I picked. So the highlight of this basically is, again, cmdletbinding, and also when you want sometimes a little slicker interface to your PowerShell scripts, calling on the common dialogues to do things like saving or opening or doing font selection, things like that. It's a great way to do it, and you kind of get a slicker look to your scripts without a lot of work, really, and it's reusable, so it's kind of nice. And for this is actually a topic you can go on. Microsoft has a whole thing documented, the about functions, advanced parameters. So I think slide. Okay, so go on to the next. So we got another meme. Now I want to talk about separate subject, which is script modules. So what are script modules and why? So a script module is PowerShell's equivalent of a DLL, for a better purpose. It's a place where you can store your functions, and PowerShell can find them automatically. And once you load this function library, all the functions are available, even variables that you want can be available, and it's automatically located by PowerShell. Nice thing about it is it simplifies coding, maximizes reusability. You can create a module that could be used by any number of people, and there's places where PowerShell automatically looks for modules. So a little about PowerShell script modules. Early days, PowerShell 2.0 and earlier, I believe, you could not write modules in script. You couldn't write them in PowerShell. You had to write them in something like C#. And I believe 3.0 and after, you could switch and you could actually write complete standalone modules, basically just functions that are available and exposed. You could write them complete in PowerShell code. You can have as many functions as you want in a script module. a script module is just a script. That's all it is. But it has the extension PSM1 instead of the usual PS1. And it must be placed in a folder that PowerShell is going to look for modules. So that's the biggest requirement. And it must be stored in a folder of its own with the same name as the module. So if I call it module 1, the script is called module1.psm1, and it has to be in a subfolder of module 1. Now, where that subfolder resides depends on where PowerShell is going to look for things. So we're going to just walk through the steps, and I believe I have slides we can walk through first, and then I'll kind of demo it. But first is determine where to locate the script module. That's the first step. Then create the subfolder to hold the module, and then save the script that you want to be the module with the PSM1 extension where you need it. So where to locate the module, there's two ways to do this. One way is to, if you really want to be specific and perhaps put it in a shared path that Windows might look at, you can see where that is by looking at the environment variable env ps module path. And so if I just take this for a minute and pop over here, and you can see in the lower window that there's a whole string. It's like the old path statement in DOS. It's got all these strung together folders. And near the end of there, you'll see that there's actually my folder users, Bryan Cafferky, documents, PowerShell modules. It's actually one Windows PowerShell. So under documents, Windows PowerShell / modules, it's like the fourth one in. That's where the user located modules should be put. That's where PowerShell will look for your modules. So when you're developing, at least, that's where you want to put it. When you deploy it to a server, you may put it in one of the other folders so that multiple people can see it at the same time. So if I were to import a module, it's going to go first to the Windows, the high level one. Actually, it is my Windows one, but it will also look through paths for looking to see if there's done to program files or Windows folders and things like that. So there's a whole hierarchy of how it can go, and you can change this since it's an environment variable. But so in this case, we're going to place the script under the Windows PowerShell directory under my documents folder. And let's see. So just as an example kind of on the slide, as you can see some code there. This is an example. I'm going to save it. It comes up as module PS1. I want to save that. And so I'll go into this normal save as, and I'm going to go to, if you notice at the top, it's my documents. It's users, Bryan Cafferky, my documents, Windows PowerShell modules. And under there, I'm going to create another folder. So I'm actually creating a new folder called UMD module. And I use UMD just to clarify that this is a user-defined module as opposed to something that Windows put in. And then once I get that folder, I can save my script as UMD module.psm1. Once that's been done, I can use the import module command to just load my module in, and any functions defined in that module become available to me. So as an example, we'll kind of do that. So we just happen to be in UMD module PSM1. It's already got the extension, but the idea is still the same. So I'm going to go to Documents. And what I'm doing is I'm going to save the script, but this time I'll put it as a module. And then here I'm going to say New Folder. I'm going to say UMD module. And then I just got to find it again. And then I'm going to save my script as the same name. And now it's there. And I can now say, and just say UMD module. Now if I run the script, and if you learn to put spaces between things, it really helps. Okay, it might have some sort of error in my code. Okay, but yeah, I might have something in there. But the main point of this, let me just see if I can. So there's this function here, out pipeline, just as an example that I should be able to use now for my module. And And it did pipe it through. So basically, it just wrote that out through out pipeline. And what is different with that is it told us at the end there's 9 items. It did, and it also put there's no pipeline yet, so it was kind of demoing this. So it looks like I have a glitch in the actual code somewhere. I'm not really sure because I tested earlier. I didn't get it, but rest assured that that code error would also occur whether or not it was a module. But the main point here is you can now access anything which is in the module code. So any of these different functions become available. Now there's an extra feature you can do, which is to say export. You can say at the bottom if you want, export, and then select what functions and variables you want exposed through the module. If you do that, then you take the responsibility of naming everything you want exported. So if you're lazy like me, I tend to let it export everything for my own use. If this is something where you want private functions and then external functions and you're going to make it usable by other people, then you probably want to take a little more control than that. Okay. So a couple of things, and this is something that a lot of people are very big on, but when you're creating script modules, it's a good idea to do a module manifest. And like most things with Microsoft, there is a built-in commandlet to help you. So new-module manifest will actually walk you through entering the different things for a manifest. Manifest is really just a template that documents the basic things about the module, who wrote it, why, when, where, all the things, tells you a little about it, and it's good for documentation purposes. If you're going to make it something that is available externally, you want to make it available on the internet for other people to download, you probably want to do some sort of code signing with it as well so that it's secure and people can't mess with it. Okay, so another thing, the thing I liked about modules is they're really cool because you can now centralize your functions where you can reuse them whenever you want them and you don't have to keep reinventing the wheel or doing a lot of dot sourcing of script files. However, one thing I don't like about the script modules is that it's not very good for maintenance in that if you have a script module with 50 functions in it and you have one developer who needs to go in and make a change to one function and another developer needs to make a change to another function, you're always in that one piece of code, that one big script. So it's not very modular in that sense. It makes it harder for proper maintenance. So I actually was trying to figure out myself a good way to like break this out. And what I found was a way to sort of leverage dot sourcing with the module and allow me to get the benefits of both. So that's really the goal is how can we get the benefits of a script module but not have to put all of the functions in one script. So this is the actual code that solves the problem. And it's deceptively simple, I guess I would say. And I'll keep emphasizing the use of document tags at the top of functions. It's a really nice thing to do. It's grateful for you'll be grateful for it later when you go back, but it's also really a nice thing for your fellow developers. So what I'm doing here in this function, it's actually the module code itself. When a module loads, not everyone realizes, but you have a lot of control when the module loads over what it does. It's an actual script itself running, so you can do things in it. And what I do here is I create a variable called function path, and I put it equal to, and I'm not using the join path, probably should be, but I just concatenate the strings. And I'm using PS script root. What PS script root is an interesting little variable. It's a variable that has a value only when code is running. And what it holds is the location of that code. So what it's really going to do is point to the module path itself. It's going to tell me exactly where the module is. So now I know where that is. And I wanted to put my functions one level down in a subfolder called function. So function path is basically going to be the path to where my module is / function. And the next line is going to do get child item, and it's going to take function path, and it's going to return a list of the names, just the names of each of the scripts. And then I just iterate over the function list by using a for each. So I'm going to get all of the functions in function list, so that full list of my functions, and then I just do a dot source, and the parentheses force it to resolve the concatenation of function path with function name, and then it's going to dot source it. So it'll iterate over this. So a nice thing is if I add another function into that library or that folder, it'll just pick it up and that becomes part of my module. So it's kind of a nice little feature that I can not have to hard code into my script module everything. Instead, this is, if you really look at it, it's a generic script module. I could copy this and call it any module name I want, and it will just look to a subfolder called function, and it will load whatever's in that subfolder, and that'll be my module. Okay, so a couple of points here. Each function is stored in its own script file by this method. $PIS script root has the path to where the module is loading, so I don't have to hard code anything, and that's what you want to avoid. If I were to move this to a server, to somebody else's machine, PS script root will point to wherever it's running from. It doesn't, it's all relative, so it's always going to be right. And function is just underneath that. So we get the full path to the function scripts. Now, if we wanted to, we could just use PS script root and put all the functions right in the same folder. And that's fine, really. It's not a big deal if you do it that way. It's less work in some ways because you don't have to maintain a separate function folder. And then we're just looping over each file. The benefits, again, each function can now be maintained in TFS and checked in and checked out separately. Different developers, therefore, can work on different functions simultaneously. The individual functions can be deployed without changing the module itself. And to remove a function or add, you just either add it into the folder or take it out. And another nice thing is you learn after a while in coding that any change to any code can break it. You don't even intend it. You accidentally hit a space bar when you're in the code and you broke something, you didn't even know it. So this way you're really isolating what's happening. Makes it a lot easier to debug and to avoid really introducing bugs. And the module itself is generic and reusable. All right, so kind of demoing that a bit. So let's see. Okay, so let me get in here for a minute, sorry. Okay, so to give you an example, I'm going to import UMD application, which does the dot sourcing method the way I said, and then I'll just use this to demo it. So we can see that worked, and this is the code to UMD application. So it's exactly what you saw before. It's going through and it's loading in all these different functions. So can I go UMD application? You can see the function. So you can see there's 3 different functions, each one separate, and now it iterates through. So when I did the import, all right, let me do. So when I did this import and ran that, it actually just pulled in the one that had been .source. So all 3 of those scripts were loaded in .source, so they're in memory just like any other module. And I can run this to show me what's in there. And you can see the exported functions are there. So that shows what's in that application. And this script actually leads me into another topic, but the main point of that whole exercise was just a nice way to get the benefits, again, of a script module, but be able to keep every function in a separate script file so you can maintain it easier. And I think that's a big help. Not sure, at some point Microsoft will probably implement something more along those lines, and who knows, maybe they haven't, I missed it. The other thing I wanted to highlight is there's a kind of an interesting feature with import module in which you can call the module in and then you can say something as custom object. And I found that really interesting because what it essentially does is it takes the module and creates a pointer to the module, and then you can manipulate that pointer, that variable name, as if it was an object, and it treats the functions pretty much like methods. So taking something similar to what I did before, but now I'm going to run these 2 lines. And what I'm doing is I'm creating a reference to my math object, but I'm pointing it to this. And as custom object is telling it to take all the methods, all the functions that are in that module, and attach them to my math object as methods, basically. And then I can call functions on it like this. Now, little bug I'll point out here is, notice I have to put single quotes around the function. That's actually, interestingly enough, a odd caveat of having used the dash. If you don't use a dash in your function name, which is the proper naming for Cmdlets, you don't have to do this single quoting. Microsoft complains about it if you don't. PowerShell doesn't like it when you don't put the single quotes around it if it's got the dash. So kind of an oddity there. I would call that a bug because that is the proper convention. But the main point in this is a way of sort of, if you want to have sort of the equivalent of an object using a module, this is a nice way to do it. What I like about it is sometimes you may have the risk of naming conflicts between modules, and you can get tripped up in PowerShell because it doesn't really namespace modules. So it's not like it has some prefix that you can say this module is something different. So a way to avoid trouble, especially if you think there's a high risk of that, is you could do this method where you import the module directly to a variable, and then if you manipulate it through the variable using the functions that way, you'll always be pointing to the right one. You won't be confusing one from another. Avoiding that kind of problem is why I do the naming things like UDF, things like that, because I'm always afraid Microsoft or somebody will come up with a module and they will say something like invoke multiply number, and if I didn't put the UDF, I'd run high risk of conflicts between my functions and Microsoft's or some other party. So, okay, so a couple of things now about module cmdlets. Just a few things. Import module, you probably all used it. If you used a dash force parameter, that forces it to clear out and reload a module, which is kind of handy at times. And we just saw using the as custom object parameter, which is kind of a cool thing because it returns it as an object. You can use remove module to just clear a module out of memory. New module will create a dynamic module. Read some things on it, have not really had a need for a new that kind of thing, a dynamic module. A little like dynamic SQL code, I guess. But if you need it, that's how you would create one, sort of in memory, create it, throw it away. Get module, list modules, and the contents. We talked about new module manifest, which will kind of, it's really more of a wizard. It'll walk you through creating a module manifest and save the folder, the file for you. And test module manifest just verifies. It's a commandlet to verify the manifest. Okay, so. Okay, and again, we did this as custom object thing. I like to copy everything in slides because I think later on, if I'm not here to, my lovely voice to explain these things to you, you can see it in the screenshots and it's like comes back to what we talked about. Okay. So, next thing, adding a Windows GUI to PowerShell. A lot of people do this, and one of the things I really love about PowerShell is that you can create a WinForm GUI in PowerShell, and it's completely standalone. It's all in PowerShell code only. You don't have to deploy any extra DLLs or any kind of file pieces, which is nice. You can also do WPF applications. I think it was Mike Robbins or somebody the other day that posted a blog. I don't think it was his, but it was somebody that's on WPF. Really cool, very slick. I'm a little more partial to WinForm just because I like the complete independence it has and simplicity for me. But WPF has a lot more, I think, advanced features. So you can do a lot with it. I'll give you a couple examples of doing a WinForm application just to see what you could do. So actually I had at one point I did a sort of BI self-service kind of thing with WinForm. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit too about accessing the database. So I'm going to use SQL PS here, which can be a little verbose at times trying to get things in. The thing I don't like about SQL PS is that it takes a long time to load, and it loads a lot of stuff that you probably don't need. It loads things for like analysis services and all kinds of stuff that's just time consuming, and it usually complains a lot too. You have to put things like, I have name checking disabled, and it still complains about a lot of stuff. So I'm kind of letting it go through that, and I'll talk while hopefully it loads. And I just want to kind of demo what can be done. I actually wrote this with Sapien, and they have a really great product called PowerShell Studio, but I was too cheap to pay for it in the beginning, and they had at the time something called the Community Edition. So the Community Edition allowed me to use their tool to paint my forms, and then it would convert it to PowerShell scripts. And so that saved me a lot of grief, so very helpful. And eventually I turned around and gave in, and it was well worth it. I bought PowerShell Studio, which every year they have a new number. Now it's up to PowerShell Studio 2016, and you get all that kind of stuff.
Hey, Brian, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Just real quick, I'm sorry. I wanted to jump in about SQL PS before, but I had accidentally muted my mic. Those three issues have actually been addressed in the April 2016 release of SSMS. It no longer takes a super long time to load. It no longer changes the directory, and it no longer complains about the unapproved verbs. So, so you should download that, and then we'll also paste a link into the chat so that everybody can go and see it. It's super cool. Okay, sorry, go on.
Cool, excellent. That's good to see they did that. So what this does is this is a custom form, has the name and address, all that kind of stuff, and I can download and I can say, gee, I want to hopefully find a table I actually have stuff in, but So you get something like that, and it just queries it, and I can change databases and things. So this is kind of a generic template. So this is completely written in PowerShell. There's no external dependencies, and it can do SQL querying and all that stuff. It's directly querying. It's not using actual SQL. Well, actually, sorry, that is using SQL PS. That's why it took so long in the old version. And to give you an idea, though, why you want to use a third-party tool to do WinForm applications, this is the code that Sapien Community Edition generated to do that form, which is a fairly simple form. So you can get the idea. It's like a lot of work. You have to tell it where to place everything and indexes, tab indexes, all this stuff. So it's a lot of stuff you probably don't want to have to write by hand. So if you're going to do a lot of GUI stuff, my recommendation is either Sapien PowerShell Studio, or there's one called the Admin Script Editor, which also will let you. It's free now. It's company went out of business, and you can get it for free online. All right. Okay. So finally, accessing SQL Server without the PS module, and generally, I still, even with the new module, I like to know exactly what code is being used. So you may still use this when you're doing something where you really want to access SQL Server as quickly and efficiently as possible. So an example going in here is to, there it is, sorry. So here's my function, invoke UDF SQL statement. Again, I like to do the UDF thing just to make sure I know it's my stuff. Big thing in debugging, you don't want to pound your head on the wall for a while and realize it's not your code, it's somebody else's. And then you get the cmdlet binding. And so if I run this, and then I'm going to just run a quick query to use it. And you can see it came back, so it just ran this query. And I'm using name passing parameters. And I'm telling it where, and then I just do this little query. And I use this select because it's a switch parameter that says, is this going to return data or not? You can do the verbose and all that stuff. So not to go by too quickly, but the big thing with this function is it's using the direct connection to SQL Server client. And then you're just opening the connection. And then based on the switch, it knows whether it needs to get a data adapter and pass data back. If it's not, if it doesn't have to, then it's like a delete or something like that that doesn't return data. So. Okay, so finally, and I'll try to cover quick because I know we're running low on time. Last thing is configuration. So professional applications, big problem. SSIS is really good for this, especially in the latest with the catalog, but you sometimes need to change things like server names, and maybe it's a distribution list or folder names, things like that. You don't want to have to go in and change scripts to do that. So what you can do is I wrote a sort of a module that'll let you do this by just maintaining a short name value pair table. All right, so let's go back here. So this function, what it does is very simple. It's meant to be a module. It is actually set up as a module, but I just have it here so I can show it. And what it's going to do is it's going to, again, use the script root path wherever the module is located, and then it's going to look for this file, psappconfig.txt. And what it's going to do then is it's going to assign this variable to be everything that's in that file, but it's going to convert it. So basically it becomes a hash table. By doing this convert from string data, I end up with a hash table. And what I can do because of that now is if you call get configuration, UDF configuration, and ask for a given key, it returns the value for the key. So example, I'll run this without so much the module approach, but just to give you an example, here it's asking for the EDW, Enterprise Data Warehouse Server name, and I'll just run the whole script together so we can see how it works. Oh, shoot. Okay, let me, I'll do it a different way. I'll say app config. Okay, so I was getting confused because it's not really a module. But the point here is, so I imported this because it's also in my module folder. And when I asked for EDW server, it returned local. And if I go into modules, UMD app config, you can see I have this little file here, and if I say open with Notepad, it's just a bunch of name value pairs. So nothing really fancy. But the nice thing is if I want to add another variable to it, something like a new folder name, maybe it's the finance server or something, I can just add that into that list of name value pairs, and the module will automatically allow me to get it by reference, by a name as opposed to the actual value. So I could just say get me finance folder, and boom, that comes back. So the main point of that is that kind of configuration is very simple, nice easy way that you can just change the text file and you never have to code changes to the actual code itself. Okay, so let me go back here. Okay, and I'll talk real quickly on this, and I think we're getting a little bit short on time. So this is really just a quick highlight of using the pipeline. So people kind of avoid it, and I won't get into the code example because we're running low on time, but all you really need to use to code for the pipeline is you'd say function, just like you always do. This is not using the cmdlet binding. I could have used it. And the block that starts with the word begin is a reserved word for PowerShell, and that says that's going to execute. If a pipeline is piped into this, that will execute before the pipeline is processed, before it's even started. So that's the first thing it does. Then for every row in the pipeline, the process block will execute, and end will run only when the pipeline's been exhausted. So a great example is if you're writing to, say, a database with a file coming in, you would probably in the beginning open up the connection to the database, and then the process you would maybe do an insert for every row coming through the pipeline, and at the end you want to close the connection. So that's kind of the purpose of the three parts. And at the bottom you can see an example of calling with get child item and then pipe it into out UDF pipeline. So it's going to take what's like basically a directory and pipe it into the out UDF pipeline, which is going to start out by printing a message at the top, then it's going to do the process, and then it's going to say there are so many items. And I actually used that at the very beginning of the presentation. So that's the main thing at this. I would encourage people to use the pipeline. It's very easy to write code for, and it really is one of the nicest things about PowerShell. Okay, so we've talked pretty quickly about maximizing reuse, extensibility with script modules, support for user interaction, going after SQL Server directly with a function, adding support for configuration, and finally we did a quick touching on the pipeline. So the big abilities, if we could call it that, and that's about it. So if any questions, whatever, can go from there.
All right, no questions in the chat window just yet, but they usually pop up within a few seconds. Great presentation, great info.
Great. Really like
Looks like we've already got a question in there. Do you see the questions box on the GoToMeeting navigator?
I see the chat window. Is that where it is?
Should be right around there, right in that tree.
I don't seem to be seeing it. Do you want to
Should
read it to me maybe, and I can just take it from there?
Sure thing.